So now you're in for a little bit of a historical treat here. And I know that because we did this last year and it was such a great success, we decided to repeat it. So you're going to be hearing from two of our renowned faculty members, now retired, about important parts of the Tufts history and why this is such a special place. Our first speaker is former Provost Saul Gittleman. Did any of you go to Tufts College? Were you? He was probably there. Saul has been around for more than 50 years. He is an absolute beloved faculty member. In his latter years there, he was teaching a course on Yiddish literature, which everybody referred to as Yid Lit. And it was such a popular course that it was taken by large swaths of undergraduate students, some of whom had heard what Yiddish was before, and many auditors of people like us who heard about this. In the last year he taught it, which was what, 2015, my wife audited it, and she just loved it. And she actually, one day when I was going to be over there for something else, she said, "You've got to come here, Saul, do this." And she was right. He was indeed an enchanting lecturer. So he's considered a sort of a national treasure of Tufts. And although he's retired, he's around a lot. And I get copies of pertinent Wall Street Journal articles from him about once every 2 weeks before I wake up in the morning. He's extremely active even in his retirement. Saul has a perspective on not only the university, but on the medical school, as having been part of the administration at the university and seen the development of the medical school that nobody else has. And with that, let me turn it over to Saul to tell you about it.
Okay. All right. Is this okay? Is this working? Okay, so I'll talk fast. My mother used to say, "Sleep fast, your father needs the pillow." We only had one pillow in our house. And so I talk fast, I'll sleep fast. David's got to come on, and we've got a schedule to keep to. The past year and the conversation has been dominated by the presidential election. It's so refreshing to be here for already a whole hour and a half and not to hear the name mentioned. But it's part of our year's activity, really. The general consensus has been, for those people who live in the bubbles of the East and West Coast and know nothing about the center of the nation, the people who elected our current president, really, that there has never been a time when there was so negative and hostile conversation about foreigners, people of color, immigrant. It brought out a level of hostility never seen before. That's not quite true. And what I simply want to remind you of is this country has been through this several times before, and that this is not anything that's terribly new. I tied it into something that happened to be part of Tufts history, and that in Boston, Tufts University School of Medicine, and the field of eugenics. Now, eugenics is not genetics. Eugenics turned out to be a quasi-scientific field of biology that had enormous credibility after Darwin at the turn of the century for the next 40 years, when we had eugenics research going on in this country to determine who was smart, who was dumb, who was white, who was not white. This was a country that has traditionally been dominated by color, by race, and by faith, and a variety of other different things. And it's been our footprint since the first pilgrim put a foot on Plymouth Rock. These are the 23 candidates who were candidates for the presidency over a year ago. Every one of them came from a generation or some person who would be described today as a loser. somebody who came to this country out of desperation. And let me remind you and myself, nobody came to this country because they were doing terrific somewhere else. They came here because life was terrible for them. They were dreadful. Everyone, you just go right from the left to the right, and each one can trace back their evolution over even 400 years to some people who were having a hard time. Coming to America, and the thing that's remarkable about this country is our capacity to assimilate. We're able to assimilate people. We're able to take people in 2 or 3 generations and turn them into Americans. People complain about the Latinos. Well, the most popular name for second-generation Latinos born in the United States are Kevin and Ashley. You know, they want to be American. People want to come here and they want to be Americanized as fast as they can. But we have never, ever welcomed people to this country. The people who got here immediately took a look at the next boatful and said, "We don't like you." Now, in 1620, the Pilgrims came here seeking religious freedom, right? They're this beautiful, loving, nostalgic people looking at there, praying, thanking God for wonderful. Who are these people? Why did they come here in 1620? Something was going on in Europe in 1620. There was a war going on that was eponymous. The war has been named after the length of time that war lasted. In a couple of months, you're going to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther nailing 95 complaints up against, there must be a Lutheran in this group, nailing 95 complaints up against the Catholic Church and starting the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation sort of stewed for 100 years, and then Europe decided in 1618 they were going to have it out. And they're going to decide what's going to be and how it's going to end. And Catholic and Protestant started butchering each other in the first major war, Christian killing Christian. Here they came in 1620. They couldn't stand it anymore. They were looking for freedom. Within 30 years, they were hanging Quakers on the Boston Common. The Protestants, now which number 900 different religious sects in America alone, learned to hate each other. Freud was wrong about a lot of things, but one thing he was absolutely right about was an idea he called the narcissism of minor difference. You know, it doesn't take a lot of difference between you and somebody else to learn to hate each other. And that's what the Protestants did. Here, this woman, Mary Dyer, and if you go up to the Boston Common, look underneath the State House, there's a beautiful monument to Mary Dyer there. She was a woman who came to the United States, came to America in 1634. She was a Quaker. She came from exactly the same place that all the other English had come from, the same district. She spoke the same language. Everything was terrific. But she went into church and quaked in the presence of God. Then she happened to rip all her clothes off. So she made things a little interesting. And she wouldn't go away. She would not go away. She kept coming back. And finally, in 1660, after they nailed her tongue to the roof of her mouth, they hanged her because she wouldn't shut up either. So intolerance came right with it. And it was Protestants versus Protestants in the 17th century. America was a Christian theocracy. The colleges were founded for that very reason. Harvard was for the Congregationalists. If you weren't a Trinitarian Christian of the Congregationalist group, nobody wanted you. The people that decided, the Calvinists in that group said they're not religious enough. They went to New Haven and created Yale. They were drowning Baptists on the banks of the Charles River. Calvinists were drowning Baptists on the banks of the Charles River. They were going for baptism, held them under. So that they had to leave town. They went and formed another Christian city. They named it Providence. Great. This was a Christian country. It always has been a nation of faith. The Presbyterian evangelicals were convinced that Christ was going to return to New Jersey. So they left here and settled down in New Jersey, waiting for Jesus to return. Because this country was settled by people who expected an apocalypse immediately. They thought the Indians might have been the 10 lost tribes. This was a country simply infused with millennialism, evangelicalism, and messianism, that Christ was going to come and settle in this wilderness. William and Mary was for the Anglicans. There were few Catholics. The only thing that could get Protestants to agree with each other was their hatred of Catholics. So that again is the narcissism, minor difference. I hate you, but I hate them more. There were few Catholics. Georgetown College was founded in the 18th century, and they had an opportunity to go there. But faculty from Harvard were involved in the hanging of Mary Dyer. There were faculty at Harvard and victims from Harvard who were hanged in Salem in 1693. The devil was alive in New England. To this day, over half the American people believe in Satan, and over half the American people accept the seven-day creation story. It may not be that way in Boston or Los Angeles or San Francisco, but if you want to know where America is, don't live within an hour of an ocean. Get out and find out what the rest of the country is. More people attend the Creationist Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky this year, where you have children riding on the backs of dinosaurs, than came to the Museum of Fine Arts. They had over 3.5 million visitors, and that's the heart and soul of America. Some of you may be people of faith, some of you are not. There are more people of faith in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Branson, Missouri, and that's what America has been and continues to be all about. Now, anybody coming on the next boatload was in trouble. This country, they tried to stop the immigration on and off in the course of this immigration, but they always needed people. By 1803, when we got the Declaration of the Louisiana Purchase, we really needed people. But the trouble was Europe was running out of Protestants, and they had to bring over the next desperate, starving, hungry boatloads, and they were the Irish, and they were Catholic. The Irish Catholics started coming over in the 1820s, and the 1870s was their great tsunami period. About 20-30% of them died on shipboard, and they throw the bodies over. Then they'd get into Boston Harbor, New York Harbor, and another 20% would die. They wouldn't let them in. So it was, and then you look at the newspapers, go on Google and Google cartoons and articles, broadsheets about Irish Catholic immigrants in the 19th century. They were called maggots, they were called vermin, they were called non-white. That tradition began back in Benjamin Franklin's days with the Germans. When you wanted to distinguish yourself from other people, you said they were not white. If you read Benjamin Franklin's memoirs, he describes the Germans as swarthy. Now, there's probably more German DNA out here. The Germans still constitute the largest genetic code in America, larger than the Latinos, larger than anybody else. The Germans started coming in the 17th century, continued coming in huge numbers, and so they spread, they intermarried eventually, and that spread their stuff around. And they were called black, swarthy, dark. They were not. The country was Anglo-Saxon and wanted to remain Anglo-Saxon, and they didn't like Germantown, Pennsylvania. They didn't like Rittenhouse Square. They didn't like Muhlenberg. The Anglo-Saxons hated the Germans. First time they tried to pass a law, 1790, the Connecticut congressman got up on the floor of the Senate and said these boorish Germans and their boorish languages. The Germans wouldn't give up German. There were more newspapers printed in German in Philadelphia than were printed in English. But they eventually earned it. They became America's brewers and eventually earned their whiteness. The Irish came next and they were black. They were not white. And that now science had progressed a little bit. In the middle of this 1820 to 1870 period, we get Charles Darwin, and that gave for a lot of popular, confused ideas about race, color, survival of the fittest, and all of that stuff. But the Irish were not white. They tried to, and they kept coming in and pouring in hungry and starving right through the Civil War. The Civil War was an interesting thing because it was we're a country now, by the way, without a draft, right? Our entire army is volunteer. What was the first draft in this country? The Civil War. And it was called a selective service. Why? Because you still had an option out. Your parents or you could buy your way out. All you needed was what? A money to get what? A replacement. So the typical scene was an American mother at the dockside in New York City, an Irish mother coming off the boat with 10, 12 children, and the American mother with $300 in silver in her hand, $100 a kid. And he said, I'll give you $300, you give me your 3 youngest children. They'll be safe. We'll put them in the army, they'll be safe. They thought they'd be safe. What did they use 10 and 11 and 9-year-old kids for? Fifes, drums, and these kids' Irish mother, desperate, and Irish mothers will do that. To save the other 9 or 10 or 11 kids, I'll get rid of my 3 or 4 if I have to save the majority. Terrible decisions, but the Irish mothers did it. Those kids went from boat to battlefield and were dead before anybody knew about it. When the casualties were posted in July of 1863 in New York City, the Irish mothers went crazy. and rioted. The New York City riots, you might have seen Scorsese's Gangs of New York. They went rioting on what do you do? What do poor people do? They attack other poor people. So they hang blacks on the street. They hang Chinese. They burned a Chinese orphanage. Anybody who was of a poor and colored went up on a rope. And so it was a terrible thing. But the Irish eventually earned their whiteness and became white. You could do that. They called it lace curtain respectability. You could gain your whiteness. Catholics gradually got accepted. The first Catholic mayor of Boston was Hugh Duffy, 1884. You start seeing him in government, teachers, prize fighters, baseball players. They were gaining a certain amount of respectability. But in this country, if you weren't white, you were invisible. That novel, The Invisible Man, wasn't written until 1952 by Ralph Ellison. But it was really, the blacks were invisible. 1952? Go look at an MGM musical, look, Singing in the Rain or anything, the chorus, the people, everything. You know, if you're black, you were a tap dancer maybe, or spoke with some kind of shuffling black accent. That was the way people have called Japanese. We had just finished locking them up during World War II in detention camps. The American Indian had no voting rights at all. It was a country that was still dominated by white Protestants, and that was well into the 1950s. But in the 19th century, it was this: if you were white, you were simply invisible. If you were black, there was slavery. Activist Supreme Courts, we've always had them. In 1857, they accepted the Constitution. They said the Constitution is right. A black man is worth only 3/5 of a white man. That's what the Constitution says. Emancipation didn't work after the Civil War. Reconstruction, 65 to 1877, failed. It was separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, said the races are now permanently separated. If you were yellow, you built the Great Western Railroads in China, and then that was it. Who were the foremen on that? The Irish had made it up now to a higher level, and they could take the look at the Chinese coolie labor, send them up into the mountains in baskets, say, throw the dynamite now, and then laugh if they left them up there not to get blown up with the dynamite, which happened more times than others. They came down, those that were alive and weren't buried along the Western railroads, crept on their hands and knees to the cities of the West and formed what? Chinatowns. The Chinatowns came after that. 1869, they built the railroad. By 1870, there was already a Chinese Exclusionary Act, then the Japanese Exclusionary Act, and they were out. If you were red, it was disease, futile wars, Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, treaties, reservations, broken treaties, and you were dying in huge numbers. So color meant everything. If you were brown, reluctant Americans in Texas and California had no idea how they got mugged. But suddenly in 1846, they became American citizens when we went in and took California and Texas. So that was manifest destiny. For whom? White, for white folks. And it was always that way. If you were Irish Catholic, you were still not white, but eventually you're going to get it. So what was the meaning of manifest destiny? From Lewis and Clark to the Spanish Civil War, from sea to shining sea, it was this country was built for us. And in between these two oceans, we could say we are not expansionist. All we did was keep moving left till we got to the other ocean, and we owned it all. And we said, how did we get it? It's God's will. And that's the way the 19th century went. But we needed cheap labor. So the country, it was still a kind of wonderfully rapacious capitalism. We had to expand, we kept going, and we needed cheap labor. End of the 19th century, we're in the Industrial Revolution, and we had the last massive immigrant wave of the 19th century, from 1880 to 1920. Two more, quote unquote, non-white peoples. They were called non-white, the Jews and the Italians. Now, the Italians were Catholic. Did the Irish Catholic welcome the Italian Catholics? Forget about it. You could bring home anybody. Bring home a Jew. Don't bring home an Italian. So that sense of that's narcissism. They're all Catholic. Did the German Jews welcome the East European Hasidic Jews? No. Mrs. Schiff took one look at these dirty people speaking what language? Yiddish. They all speak German. You speak German, you become a Presbyterian, you're Episcopalian, you convert, you change from Schoenberg to Belmont, and you're an American. And you don't want to get reminded who these people are. Well, they were. So the Jews and the Italians were driven together because their fellow Jews and fellow Catholics wanted nothing to do with them. In Eastern Europe, the Tsarist May laws of 1881, it was time to leave the shtetls, the dirty, filthy little villages that were now being attacked and burned down. Dead children, after these people had nothing and no hope. So it was a question of get out or not make it. So they left the Pale of Settlement where all the Jews were located in Eastern Europe. In Poland, there was no Poland. Poland had disappeared from the map of Europe already. And they walked across. They walked to Bremerhaven. They walked to ports, any place they could to get on a ship. It cost you anywhere from $5 to $15 to get on a ship. They were also fleeing Italian poverty from Rome down. Everything had failed. The crops had failed. These people were desperate. The northern Italians hated the southern Italians. I mean, Freud is so clever. They did an interview with an Italian peasant in the New York Times talking about the European Union. And they say, how do you feel about the European Union? This was 3 weeks ago. And he said, the European Union, I hate the people in the next village. Forget the European. I got somebody closer to me to hate. So what do I have to worry about that? That is what you call human nature. Now, from steerage from Naples, and $15 in 1890 it cost, you got there, you were in steerage, you were between the decks. When the Titanic went down, most of the people who drowned were between the decks. Italian steerage, this is what it looked like. They didn't have enough people, they didn't have enough room between the decks, they piled you on top, getting ready to enter the new acceptance station in New York Harbor, which had to be opened in 1892 because there was the people were pouring in. I mean, Chicago was the second largest Polish city in the world. It was also the second largest Swedish-speaking city. Huge numbers of people still coming because we needed cheap labor. And if you read some newspaper like the Wall Street Journal, conservative, Republican, they're still about immigration. What's the Wall Street Journal policy about immigration right now? Open the doors. They want cheap labor in, so they are very pro-immigration. What they don't understand is their constituency. And so the Ellis Island was opened up in 1800 because America needed cheap labor. Entering New York Harbor, whatever Emma Lazarus said on the base of the Statue of Liberty, welcome, welcome, forget it. Nobody got welcomed anywhere. They came here and they did whatever they had to do to survive, and some made it and some didn't. 1892, they built this place on a little land spit in New York Harbor just to help process the hundreds of thousands who were arriving at Ellis Island, coming off the boat, some husbands yes, husbands no, families, whatever. They got, the Italians and the Jews were driven together, and they lived in the filthiest places in the world. Little Italy, Little Israel, Lower East Side of New York, the North End Boston was Italian and Jewish and Irish. Irish were moving out, Italians and Jews moving in. And so these places, horses dying on the streets, blowing up, abandoned Jewish children, 1893. The Jews were just barely ahead of the Italians in the number of bordellos, red light district, orphanages, gangsters, criminals, crooks, degenerates. They were all there, and they were all my family. Because that's the way it was, and that's the way it's constantly been for generations of immigrants. And when they weren't, they were treated. But Jewish children were abandoned constantly on the streets. Here's a newspaper report on the Lower East Side of New York, Little Israel. Could they ever become white? I don't read often, but here. The neighborhood where these people live is absolutely impassable. They claim to have been driven out of Poland and Russia. The neighborhood is the eyesore of New York City and perhaps the filthiest place on the Western continent. A Christian could not live there because he will be driven out by the stench and the dirt. Cleanliness is an unknown quantity to these people. They cannot be lifted up to a higher plane because they do not want to be. They can't be lifted up. They are genetically and congenitally unable. Little Italy, hopeless to think of civilizing them. They are extremely ignorant. They have been reared in the belief that brigandage is a manly occupation, that assassination is the natural sequence of the most trivial quarrel. They are miserably poor. It is not strange that they resort to theft and robbery. It is perhaps hopeless to think of civilizing them. They're beyond help. The Jews and the Italians were behind. There were also violence. The Los Angeles Times building was blown up in 1910, died by 2 Irish terrorists. 20 were dead in that one. The New York Stock Exchange was blown up by Italian, quote, the word used in the newspaper, terrorists in 1920. 37 people were dead, mostly little kids who were messengers. But violence and immigration are as American as apple pie. It was inevitable that somebody would start now reeling back. Where did it start? At Harvard. The Immigration Restriction League was founded in 1894. This was the beginning of the triumph of academic eugenics and the vocabulary of testing. Psychology departments, social relations departments saying that people coming off the boat are stupid, they're morons, new vocabulary, morons and imbeciles. There are criminal types. Here's Bugsy Siegel's mugshot. They all become degenerate. Here's Meyer Lansky's mugshot. Here is Lucky Luciano's mugshot. They were all considered degenerate and hopelessly criminal. The doors, though, stayed open until 2 Italian anarchists blew up a paymaster, killed a paymaster in Braintree, and that was it. Between 1920 and 1927, when Sacco and Vanzetti were executed, all the restrictive immigration laws were passed. And they were passed to keep these people out from polluting the gene pool, or the gene pool. They were genes, they knew about that, and it was the field of eugenics. Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt both said racial suicide if races mix. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, if you talk about taking names off buildings for reason, Wilson was a Southerner, a racist, a bigot, and was an honorable man. But this was America, and TR also felt the same way. Here's a book that I would recommend to you, written by Adam Cohen, called Imbeciles. It reflects an 8-1 Supreme Court decision in 1927, Buck versus Bell, that entered morons and imbeciles into the legal language. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the decision about Carrie Buck, saying that the last line of his decision was 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. It turns out that she was no way an imbecile. She had been raped by an uncle, an incestuous family, had suffered brutally from old childhood, and she got up to this point, and they were going to sterilize her. Well, they went ahead and sterilized 70,000 other Americans. And so this became the Supreme Court, American eugenics, sterilization, the academic institutions of the eugenics movement. This is Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, the Eugenics Records Office, which was open from 1910 to 1940. By the way, keeping all of those people out, let me see, did I read that? No, I didn't. The quotation here from this book called Imbeciles. Goddard administered the Binet-Simon test to newly arriving immigrants at Ellis Island in 1913 and got startling results. He found that 79% of Italians, 80% of Hungarians, 83% of Jews, and 87% of Russians were feeble-minded. After reworking the results, he came up with figures that still defied belief. He reported that between 40 and 50% of these groups were feeble-minded, with a mental age of less than 12. The Harvard Magazine just did an article last year because Harvard was the national leader in eugenics. The Harvard faculty were overwhelmingly pro-eugenics, and the Harvard biologists, anthropologists, Harvard presidents, Abbott Lowell was vice president of eugenics of the Restriction Information League. It's an excellent article. I refer you to it if you get a chance. It's called Harvard's Eugenics Era. Here is the hero of this very brief and chaotic slide. The Tufts University visionary who fought eugenics, Dr. Abraham Myerson, faculty member, born in Lithuania, did his first year of medical school at Columbia, didn't like it, transferred to Tufts, finished his degree here, became a lifelong faculty member here, and was the only person in Boston fighting the language of eugenics. The American Academic Voice. Here's a book written by a Harvard and Clark faculty member called Mongrel Virginians, the Wind Tribe. They took a family and they said, just like the Supreme Court decision, by the way, 8-1 decision, Oliver Holmes writes it, Louis Brandeis signs off on it. So Brandeis voted 8-1 also to sterilize. But this book, called The Wind Tribe, talks about a particularly degenerate Virginia white family who should be all sterilized. Here's Abraham Myerson's review. The only reference to eugenics I could find in the Tufts archives was his review. Otherwise, nobody was talking about it. You go to Harvard, MIT, Johns Hopkins archives, you find 40, 50,000 references to eugenics. Dr. Abraham Myerson, professor of neurology at Tufts University, reviewed in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences, called the book, quote, absolutely unscientific in method, an expose of small community moral depravity recorded from the lips of neighbors, in which the most trifling morsels of gossip, with arbitrary interpretations, with no possibility of verification, since many of the characters are dead, form the basis of judgment, unquote. He concluded his review as follows, quote, a really absurd and useless book, unquote. That's from Adam Cohen's book called Imbeciles. Now, somebody has to write a biography of Abraham Myerson. I'm not going to do it. But he also wrote on women. He was a neurologist. Here's one of the quotes from one of his book called The Nervous Housewife, 1921. 1921. We had just given the women the right to vote, so we were filled with stereotypes. Quote, whether or not it fits women to be a housewife of the traditional kind, feminism is certain to develop further. Women will enter into more diverse occupations than ever before. They will enter politics. They will find their way to direct power and action. More and more, those who work will be specialized and individualized. The women executive, the writer, the artist, the doctor, lawyer, architect, chemist, and sociologist will resist the dictum, quote, woman's place is in the home, unquote. This guy, whoever he was, Abraham Myerson, was something else. So he deserves a little bit more attention. I finished with one book. There are endless numbers of very good books on the impact of eugenics on American academic communities. And it was the academics who got that law passed that shut the door in 1920, 1924. Without the testimony of American academics, it would never have happened. But they poured in from the best medical schools in the country, not Tufts, because our faculty was not doing this. But they came and testified that the people coming off the boats from Bremerhaven and Naples are degenerate and mentally retarded. And that became the law of the land for the next 50 years. Daniel Kevlis is a very good academic historian of medicine, and he certainly, this book called In the Name of Eugenics is something I would commend you to. Thank you. Okay. Too long.
So we're going to ask you to hold questions until after David Stoller speaks, and then both of them will take questions. You can see why Saul was such a favorite professor at Tufts. He has a wealth of information and a wonderful style of presenting it. Thank you, Saul. So David Stoller was our chief of biochemistry here, chair of the Department of Biochemistry for years, but probably wasn't so happy when I shut down biochemistry and the other departments and combined them into some others, but we never discussed it, and he never sent me any nasty emails about it. As I mentioned, he also served as the interim dean of the Sackler School, and he was doing that when I arrived here 13, 14 years ago. He's a Canadian originally, went to school in Saskatchewan at the university there, then did postdoctoral work at Brandeis and served in the U.S. Air Force Office of Scientific Research in Washington. He's written a book in his retirement on one of the most famous professors here, Gerhard Schmidt, and which illuminated a whole history that many of us knew pieces of the number of outstanding professors and clinicians who Tufts and Tufts Medical Center, then New England Medical Center, brought from Germany just before the Holocaust, and the huge effect that they had on the quality of the faculty and the teaching and on Tufts University School of Medicine. So with that, let me turn it over to David.
Good morning. Well, a great pleasure to be here, to be back after last year, and to share some thoughts on history with Saul Gittleman. It's always an honor to be affiliated with Saul, a friend of many years standing, and always learn so much from your talk And I have to add, what a hard act to follow. I'm going to also talk about some historical aspects of the medical school, and it will also include immigrants, and it will also include Tufts having an enlightened view, a more upbeat, perhaps, thought about immigrants because of what Tufts accomplished. I'm going to begin, and I'm going to expand this. I talked about this somewhat last year. I'm going to expand this into a somewhat larger picture to talk about how Tufts gained a mission of transmitting knowledge to its mission of, it gained a mission of adding knowledge, of research, to its mission of teaching, of transmitting knowledge. And this was done as an addition, not a displacement, as I will explain. So as you, I'm sure, know, our medical school was founded in 1893 by 7 physicians who had previously run a school called the Boston College of Physicians and Surgeons. It was established in 1893 under an agreement with Tufts University in Medford. But it was first located at 188 Boylston Street, as Dean Berman has mentioned, where the Four Seasons Hotel is now located. And there's the plaque that he is going to send somebody over to polish. At that time, there were more than 150 medical schools in the country. There are still 150, but a much larger population. Many of those schools were proprietary or commercial schools, providing basically apprenticeship training with little underpinning in science. In fact, they were the remnants of more than 400 medical schools that were established, many of them as money-making or commercial enterprises. And it's interesting, I'll mention Abraham Flexner very shortly, but since you mentioned the cost of research, I found interesting a line in his survey report on medical education that many of those schools closed because it was with trying to reach the standards required for medical education, it was impossible to make money. There were some schools that were based on a European model, particularly Johns Hopkins and Columbia, Harvard, Penn, that involved a faculty involved in investigation as well as teaching. Tufts was somewhere in between. We had a university affiliation. We had basically a training and teaching mission only. Like many of the proprietary schools, we accepted students who had not had a previous college degree. In fact, many who had no previous college study, just a high school diploma. When Abraham Flexner did his survey of medical education and published his game-changing report in 1910, he recommended it, he saw some strengths at Tufts Medical College School, but he recommended it for closure. But that was on the basis of his premise that said that a city the size of Boston needed only one medical school. And a lot of his recommendations were based on what he thought were the number of doctors that the country needed. But Tufts survived and evolved. Admission standards were raised and larger quarters were found. That first building was rather small for what had to be accommodated. But the buildings on Shawmut Street did not have any research laboratories, and even the larger home on Huntington Street did not have many. And the Boston dispensary, which evolved into the main teaching hospital, was an outpatient clinic without permanent staff or faculty or permanent beds. There was a glimmer of research activity in early years. In 1907, there was a grant to a Dr. Leary for the study of streptococcal disease. And Dr. William Hinton was director of the dispensary labs, and although he described his test later, he was a director from 1915, he may have undertaken some investigation in connection with that. And in 1925, Dr. Alfred Bosworth at Tufts created an infant formula, which he called Franklin Infant Food, which was later renamed Similac, which is well known and still, a version of which is still marketed today. Now, there were examples of pioneering leadership. There were women students, 8 in the first class. There were social workers on the clinical staff. And in 1918 was created the Francis Stern Nutrition Clinic, the first of its kind anywhere in the world. But until the late 1920s, the mission remained the transmission of knowledge and skills. Looking back from 1970, former dean William Maloney said, Tufts continued with its goal of educating general practitioners rather than specialists. He noted there were no scholarships in the early years, no endowed funds for labs, clinic, or the hospital. But beginning in the late 1920s, we became a very different school. Without ever forgetting the importance of teaching, of supporting our students, and of modeling for them the compassionate care of patients. And I want to emphasize again, this is an expansion, not a displacement. Tufts added the gaining of knowledge, research, to its mission and its vision. And it began in a particularly interesting way that we'll get back to immigration, when the medical school was more than 35 years old. It was in 1927 that Dr. Joseph Pratt became full-time physician and head of the Department of Medicine at the dispensary. He was a Massachusetts native. He'd studied and graduated from Johns Hopkins University Medical School in 1898 and returned to Boston. And twice he went to Germany for training, in 1902 in Tübingen, in 1908 in Heidelberg. While he was there, he developed the first accurate method for counting blood platelets. He returned again to Boston to practice and to the Mass General. And there he did important clinical studies in tuberculosis and pioneered the use of group therapy in supportive treatment. Coming to the dispensary in 1927, he had a difficult challenge to build a full-time clinical faculty. His budget that year was $2,700. 2 years later, in 1929, he was joined by Dr. Sam Prodger, a graduate of Emory Medical School in Atlanta, who came to study with Dr. Pratt, but thought he was coming to a Harvard hospital. Pratt had to convince him to stay where he landed, at the dispensary. Prodger also went to Germany for some training, and he returned feeling that perhaps the balance was too much skewed towards research in Germany, but he did absorb and see the dual mission, combining the transmission of knowledge, the clinical care of patients with investigation. On the University Medical School side, in 1929, this is about the same time, David Rapport, a new chairman of physiology, was the first who was recruited for both teaching and research. And that was also the year in which the Charlton Fund donation for research was obtained by the medical school. In 1931, the Boston Dispensary, the Floating Hospital, and Tufts University affiliated to form the New England Medical Center, in time to respond to dramatic changes that were occurring in Europe and to the benefit of the dispensary and Tufts. In those days, German scientists were world leaders in physics, chemistry, physiology, and medicine. They were the most numerous among the Nobel Prize recipients. Up till 1933, they had received 31 Nobel Prizes in the sciences of physics, chemistry, physiology, and medicine. The US had 6. And 30% of those German Nobel recipients were of Jewish origin. When Hitler and the Nazis gained power in 1933, they summarily removed Jews from all state university faculty positions. The Jews' lives were turned upside down with loss of job, of social standing, of citizenship, and even life was at risk. Doctors Pratt and Prodger understood what was happening, and they knew the quality of German science and saw how they could help while benefiting the dispensary as well. With the support of Tufts University, Presidents John Cousins and Leonard Carmichael, important at that time, and funds from the Rockefeller Foundation, they began to recruit a world-class scientific clinical faculty, medical faculty, and at the same time to offer lifelines to at least 13 refugees, immigrants from Nazi-controlled Europe. Alice Ettinger was among the first. She had been invited in 1932 to visit the dispensary to demonstrate a new radiological method from Berlin, making spot films during fluoroscopy. She could not return to Germany. Dr. Heinz Magendans was also here in 1932. He was one of the two of the 13 that I mentioned who was not Jewish. He came to study, and he stayed, and he wrote that I left Germany because I did not conform to the ideologies and political doctrines of the Nazis. Siegfried Tannhauser came to the dispensary in 1935, appointed as an associate professor. In Germany, he had been a full professor and department chairman, a leading medical scientist and teacher. He had conducted research on diabetes, gout, lipid metabolism, and nucleotide chemistry, basic work. And he wrote a major textbook on clinical and laboratory medicine. Appointed to the chair of the University, chair of medicine of the University of Freiburg in 1932. He managed to hang on a while after the 1933 dismissal because of his service in World War I, but he too was ejected from the faculty as a Jew in 1934. Martin Nothman had been professor of medicine in Leipzig, published 80 articles from there. By the way, Siegfried Tannhauser had published 400 articles in Europe. Nothman's publications were primarily in endocrinology and diabetes. He was dismissed in 1933, stayed on as the chief of the Jewish hospital in Leipzig, but he was arrested on Kristallnacht in 1938. And he was sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp. He was rescued by an invitation to teach in Amsterdam, and then by an invitation from Tufts University, where he began as an instructor in 1939. Joseph Eigersheimer followed another path. Just as Germany was discarding great physicians and scientists, Kemal Ataturk in Turkey was interested in strengthening his primary university. Eigersheimer first fled to Istanbul, where he became professor, head of ophthalmology, and basically the founder of ophthalmology in Turkey. While in Germany, he had been the first to introduce arspheniamine in the treatment of ophthalmic syphilis, and was an expert in tubercular eye disease, and he introduced a surgical procedure for treating detached retina. Came to Tufts as an assistant professor in 1939. Alfred Hauptmann, a neuropsychiatrist, had been chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Halle in Germany. He was the first to use pentobarbital in the treatment of epilepsy. Though he converted to Christianity, he too had been arrested and sent to the camp at Dachau. He was released on the agreement that he would leave the country. He reached Tufts in 1939. Dr. Richard Wagner, a pediatrician, had begun an important career in Vienna. He had taken classes with Freud and with von Pirquet, who had described allergic diseases. And with Jacob Parnas, Dr. Wagner published the first description of a glycogen storage disease. He fled Vienna in 1938, got to the Joslin Clinic, and became assistant to the chief of the floating hospital and instructor in pediatrics in 1940. Gerhard Schmidt, about whom I have written a book, was a faculty member at the University of Frankfurt. He was pushed out in 1933. He was an MD, but he had studied in biochemistry with Dr. Gustav Emden. A test. Does the name Emden ring a bell? Does Emden Meyerhoff ring a bell? Gustav Emden. He studied with Emden and was on the faculty. He was ejected in 1933, and he followed a 7-year odyssey through Italy, Sweden, Canada, got to the Rockefeller University, well, it was the Rockefeller Institute at that time, to Washington University in St. Louis, and then was recruited to Tufts by Siegfried Tannhauser in 1940. And he headed the biochemistry laboratory of the dispensary, and he was elected to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 1973. Continued working in the lab till the year of his death, 1981. Berta Ottenstein was another who came via Istanbul. Dr. Tannhauser had known her when they were both in Freiburg, where she headed a dermatology clinic and lab. She had gone to Istanbul, and Dr. Tannhauser helped recruit her to Tufts a little bit later in 1944, when Jews in Turkey were becoming very fearful of how close the Germans were to the Turkish border. Other distinguished physicians add to these contributions. Heinrich Brusch headed the arthritis clinic, Jacob Schloss in gastroenterology, and Joseph Fishman in urology, and Anna Reinauer in medicine. By the early 1940s, these immigrant physician scientists constituted a significant fraction of the dispensary staff in the Tufts Medical School faculty. They helped to form a nucleus to which outstanding American physician scientists were then recruited. There followed an explosive, a dramatic growth. What a powerhouse of scientific and clinical medicine was assembled in the next 25 years. By 1965, you may recognize what it would feel like to be on a faculty with William Damashek, Edwin Astwood, Bill Fishman, William Schwartz, Morris Rebin, Jane DeForge, Louis Weinstein, Robert Schwartz, Fred Stallman, Jerome Cassirer, Barbara Carter, Sidney Gillis. This was by 1965. The growth continued, of course, in the 1970s with Seymour Reichland, with Sheldon Wolf, and the number of people that he brought with him. Research activity took hold in all the departments and in affiliated hospitals. Dramatic changes were occurring on the other side of the street as well, in the basic medical sciences. Before 1948, the only research activity was in the lab of David Rapport and his colleague, Dr. Canzanelli. In 1948, Byron Clark came to pharmacology, and Halvor Christensen the next year came to biochemistry as chair. And then, in the years 1953 to 66, under the deanship of Joseph Heyman, there were dramatic changes in the nature of the basic science departments. With the recruiting of Alton Meister, a world expert in amino acid metabolism and diseases, Morris Friedkin, Meister coming to biochemistry, Morris Friedkin, whose pioneering work in folate metabolism and antifolates, came to Tufts. Ted Park, who had discovered the mechanism of penicillin resistance, came to microbiology. Walter Hughes came to physiology, expert in protein metabolism. Laura Cavazos came to anatomy, and then Rosilio Schechter and Karen Hitchcock served as chairs in anatomy. The medical school and the graduate school the Sackler School of Graduate Biomedical Sciences, granting PhD degrees, was founded in 1980. Although doctoral degrees had been given before that, it was a special growth in the research training with faculty that was based mainly of medical school faculty at the time, but which has now expanded greatly. The Sackler School, the medical school faculty, served as a vanguard for the whole university in research, a framework for the growth of research that occurred in the schools of dental medicine, veterinary medicine, nutrition, and yes, arts and sciences and engineering. The research community continued to grow. And I apologize to all the wonderful people who are not on this, because as the dean mentioned, just the basic science faculty is now 75, and the Sackler faculty, which draws from the medicine, veterinary, dental medicine, nutrition, engineering, and arts and sciences faculties, now has 202 faculty members and 240 graduate students, as he mentioned. So how important was the impact of this growth and these changes? For one, the knowledge contributed. It's too long a list to begin to penetrate deeply, but just think of definition of autoimmune disease, treatment of hypothyroidism, introduction of immune suppressants for transplantation and autoimmune disease, understanding of renal function and electrolyte balance, the mechanism of penicillin action, understanding antibiotic resistance, antifolates in cancer therapy, retroviruses in AIDS and cancer, mechanisms of inflammation and anti-inflammatory agents, mechanisms of carcinogenesis, gene therapy, and so much more. Continuing on, if you read recent bulletins and newspaper articles, the new approach to treatment of Alzheimer's disease led by the chairman of neurosciences, Phil Hayden, and on the clinical side, something that might have been done some time ago, but an investigation as to what is the real proper dosing for drugs administered to newborns. Knowledge from this basic research has indeed been brought to the clinic through publications, that is sharing of information, through formation of new companies for drug development, and for specific programs in translational medicine. The growth of research has occurred at many, but not all, medical schools across the country, with largely public funding. And this medical research at medical schools across the country has been an important part of the basis for the almost miraculous developments in prospects for helping people through prevention and treatment of disease. Second, the impact on teaching. I believe that, informed by their own curiosity and creative inquiry, investigator teachers, being aware of new insights, are particularly able to teach the newest science and clinical science underpinning clinical management possible. An immunologist involved in touch with the immunological research is in a good position to recognize and to teach the important new and challenge the possibilities and the challenges of the new immunotherapy for cancer patients. But more important than teaching specific information, which will be outdated, a faculty with a culture of inquiry can model for our students what is an important attribute for the rest of their medical lives: questioning and openness to new information. The attraction of great students, current and you, our alumni. And the enormous amplification of what is done in the clinical and basic science laboratories as a national and international resource. Among our medical graduates who go out and expand what happened here is Rod McKinnon, M82, a Nobel Prize recipient for his basic studies on potassium transport channels. At the school centennial 24 years ago, Henry Banks listed 125 graduates who had gone on to become full professors, including leaders at our own medical school and primary important investigators. I think of Sherry Gorbach, I think of Andrew Plout, who are graduates of the medical school and continue to be important scientific and clinical figures of the medical school long after. If I can say just from my own laboratory, which is just one of the 200, Adam Goldfarb, Medicine 86, spent some time in my lab as a medical student and says it influenced him. He is now a professor of hematology oncology at the University of Virginia. Peggy Johnson, a PhD graduate in my laboratory, became assistant to the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, working and head of the NIH program on AIDS vaccine development. Sean Carroll, Sackler, 83, a PhD graduate who worked in my lab, is now Howard Hughes investigator, a director of the education program for the Howard Hughes Foundation, and he will be recognized with an honorary degree at Tufts commencement in about a week or 2 weeks. 5 others have gone on to be full professors. Others are working in biotech industry. But so many of our faculty members can name outstanding graduates who have gone on to make great contributions and expand what this research enterprise has done at Tufts. Since its founding in 1980, the Sackler School has granted 790 PhD degrees and 207 master's degrees. But this continuation of this phenomenal story cannot be taken for granted, as I think Dean Berman has indicated. We are living in a time of challenges to the financial resources and even to the cultural evaluation of research and the infrastructure that has grown here and at medical schools across the country, even to science itself. The Congress saved the NIH this week. You can't take that for granted either. Will this dual mission of transmitting and gaining knowledge be sustained culturally and financially? Thank you.